Okay, so we begin another project, which is how to set selected row values into an input box. So first, we get the public class form by double clicking on our form ID, form UI template. We move on to create a table which will hold data from the user, and we use the name table as new data table, which is for table. So we move on to define our columns using the table.columns.add, and we inputted the name of the column is ID and its data type is integer. So we further move on to define the second column, whose name is first name and data type is string. And the last or the third column is last name, whose data type is string, which means it accepts string input. So we further move on to add some rows which contain some data. So we table.rows.add. So the first one which corresponds to the ID, John corresponds with first name and Doe corresponds with last name. Same applies to the second row. So we then bind the table we created earlier. This table, which is the table in memory with the data grid, so that when you run the UI, the table will be displayed on top of the data grid view one. So we further move on to define our data grid. We further move on. So if e dot row index less than or equal to 0, then so what this does is that if maybe there are some rows with no values or contains no values, this makes sure that those rows are ignored. So we further move on to define a variable by using them selected row as data grid view is equal to data grid view one dot rows and open a bracket e dot row index. What this does is that it checks whether the selected row has some values in it, and if it doesn't have the values, we ignore it. So here we get the current values from the row you selected by defining some variables. Dim current ID as string is equal to selected row dot cell ID dot value dot toString. So what this does is that it extracts the values in those rows into the input boxes, which would be defined here. So we here extract the values and it extract it and place it into these input boxes. So dim new ID as integer is equal to C in input, enter, update, and enter new ID, update row, and current ID. So what this is that does is that when the user clicks on it, when the user sets the row, the user is asked to what? To see a message such as you will see a message when the input box UI displays, which is enter new ID, update row. So to give it our current ID. So the user will see the current ID. Same applies to this. Enter new first name, update row, and gives us the current first name. And same applies to the last one. So here update the selected row if the user decides to update or make any changes to it. So selected row dot cell ID dot value new ID if the user choose to update. So we take a look at the UI. So we begin our recording. So we set the first row. See, we have seen the value there. We've been able to extract the one layer onto the input box. So see John and do. So that is all. Thanks.